Hey there, readers. All right, so one thing I have to admit, I've got to fess up. I had bought this book online at the very beginning of this whole shutdown quarantine thing. And I was so excited because I was like, oh my gosh, it's The Wrinkle in Time. Love it. So, a few chapters in, actually, the second chapter in, I realized this is not actually the original A Wrinkle in Time. So, I'm excited to see such character development in this one, and I encourage you to put the real original Wrinkle in Time on your summer reading list for this summer. So, with that disclaimer, I'm going to head on. Chapter 6, Charles Wallace. Charles Wallace is many things: intelligent, caring, blunt, insightful, but more than anything, he has the ability to see the truth in those around him.
I'm way further ahead than I thought it
I really liked all of the adjectives that describe this character: intelligent, caring, insightful. Those are all really positive adjectives to describe someone. Hint, hint, dropping a hint bomb on the seesaw assignment. The only one that I really need you to complete this week. Alright, so he's all of those things. This is one of the things his mother and sister Meg love most about him, even if it's also one of the things that can drive them up the wall. Some people call Charles Wallace strange. Some people call him crazy. More generous folks say he marched to the beat of his own drum. And this last but not least was true. The world spoke to him in a way that didn't seem to connect with others. Charles Wallace thought it was because nobody else bothered listening. But perhaps it had more to do with the fact that Charles Wallace was gifted with a unique mind that never stopped working. Nobody knew who his birth parents were. All the adoption agencies could tell the Murrays was that his blood type was O positive, and he had been found wrapped in a flannel scarf on the steps of the library. Perhaps his birth mother had mistaken it for the entrance of a police station. The Murrays opened their hearts wide to him from the start, so Charles Wallace never longed to know more about his origins. Besides, he was too busy discovering his world. When he was a baby, his thirst was
Yeah, he's dead.
his thirst for new experiences had been undeniable. He had happily slurped up any food offered to him, from spicy curries to sweet desserts, and smiled biggest on walks where he could take in the novel surroundings and people. His adopted parents had fretted over some developmental delays. He'd never babbled or tripped over words like other toddlers. But when he turned 3 he began firing out complete, grammatically correct sentences with no hesitation, as though he'd simply been waiting to have a full command of the English language before choosing to communicate even the simplest request. While other preschoolers zipped around the playground chasing each other, Charles Wallace spent hours witnessing an ant traverse the sandy pit or lay on the grass studying the trees overhead. Once once he was in school, his teachers were perplexed at the maturity of his answers, but tissed to themselves when he failed to make close friends. If only his mother devoted more time to his social development, they'd muttered, despite how unfair it was to cast judgment on a single parent. Even though he was odd, his classmates didn't ridicule him. They treated him like an unusual alien in their midst, one who had made fascinating pronouncements that unnerved their teachers, and who could be counted on to help search for lost objects on playgrounds. Charles Wallace never hesitated to lend a hand, no matter who asked. When he did good deeds, a thrum of happiness tingled at the tips of his toes to the top of his head. Ripples of kindness flowed out from him, and although they were invisible to anyone else, Charles Wallace marveled at their mesmerizing colors. In tune as he was with the world around him, it did not surprise him when the universe came calling. All day the world around him had trembled with thrilling possibilities, like a balloon had been rubbed in his hair and then passed over his skin so that all the individual hairs stood up. Whispers of something big had come from the trees, and the bees in the garden buzzed frantically as he walked by them on the way home from school, stomping along beside him. Meg didn't even notice. Charles Wallace decided not to tell her yet. He wanted to discover the mystery on his own. "I'm going to take our dog for a walk," he announced when they arrived home. "Don't go far," Meg warned, already opening the fridge to brainstorm dinner. Clipping the leash on their black lab, Charles Wallace coughed uncommandedly. Whew! He'd go as far as he needed. Fortinbras's claws scraped over the sidewalk as the dog. I'm really stumbling over that word there for a second. Fortinbras's claws scraped over the sidewalk, and wizened dog unusually eager. Charles Wallace laughed. "I'm coming, Fortinbras. No need to pull my arm off," he said. Just a few blocks away from home, their neighbors shifted, signs of wear and tear cropping up. Storefronts were shuttered and houses crowded together, many of them also covered in plywood. Usually, Charles Wallace soaked in the graffiti, admiring the bold colors and unique tags. But that day he scrambled past, sensing his destination ahead. At the bottom step of a residence with an overgrown lawn and a darkened interior, Fortinbras stopped, his tongue lolling. "Yep, this is the place," Charles Wallace agreed. A sparking zing like bubbly soda up in his nose popped along his skin. Fearlessly, Charles Wallace climbed the stairs to the shagging porch, Fortinbras ambling beside him. At the door, Charles Wallace knocked patiently, even though the presence inside was fiercely inviting him in with unspoken energy. Someone flung open the door. "Hello." A red-headed woman appeared, speaking in a bright voice. She was draped in what looked like a flowing, comfortable white dress. "Hello," Charles Wallace answered, cocking his head. Her hair was swept to one side of her head. As Charles Wallace looked closer, he saw her toes sticking out from the bottom of her dress, and realized that she was barefoot. He was more distracted by her presence, though. Her mind seemed endless, like he was gazing at an ocean with unknown depths, while most people he met had minds that were contained, like wells or ponds. Just looking ahead, because this is a long, long chapter today. She couldn't be human, his heart thumped with excitement. "Come on in," she continued, beaming at him. "We've been expecting you." Fortinbras shuffled past her into the house, giving her his seal of approval. As he went by, she reached out and ran her fingers along his fur, her eyes widening. She held her hand up in front of her, as though she were looking for evidence that she'd sprouted fur of her own. "I've been expecting you to," Charles Wallace said, knowing it was the truth. For weeks he'd been antsy and sketching spirals of energy in on his notepad. He'd known a change was coming soon. The house was different than anything Charles Wallace had ever seen before. The inner rooms of the house were filled with books from the floor to the ceiling. The overgrown lawn had worked its way inside the house, leaving branches and flower petals scattered across the books and furniture. Snuggling on a square pillow, seemingly designed for him, Fortinbras snorted happily.
I was gonna say, today was probably
The
a work
woman
day, so she'd probably stay busy.
The woman was crouched
Thinking
next to
a lot
him,
about things.
giggling every time he breathed into her face. She didn't exactly glow, but there were tiny lights dancing around her, like fireflies. Even though she felt familiar, Charles Wallace
She
didn't know her
able to
name.
get to bed tonight, it seems like.
"I'm Charles Wallace," he offered. "Oh." She shot upright, clapping her hands. "Of course. Introductions. It's so hard to remember all the steps sometimes. We have No need for such familiarities where I come from. Oh, please forgive my mistake. I'm sure it won't be the only one I make. This is all still so new to me. You
Yeah.
can call me Mrs. Whatsit. Well, hello, Mrs. Whatsit, he said, the name skipping into his ears. It was perfect for her. Come along, you must meet the others, Mrs. Whatsit said, whisking him towards the bedroom. No, it wasn't the bedroom. I turned the page. The beaded doorway. Dozens of little balls tickled his arms as he followed her into the warm kitchen, decorated with glass-blown lanterns and hanging plates from around the world. Mrs. Whatsit swished over to a seated dark-haired woman who peered at him curiously through the strangest pair of glasses he'd ever seen. They were a solid inch thick and cut like prisms, casting her brown eyes into dozens of smaller images. A saffron yellow tunic complemented her yellow brown skin, and a ball of yarn rested on her lap as though she'd been untangling it. Like Mrs. Whatsit, she seemed to attract tiny sparks that filled the air around her. Charles Wallace, meet Mrs. Who. Mrs. Whatsit gestured at her companion. Mrs. Who, here he is. What do you think? Reaching forward, Mrs. Who grasped his arm between her own and gazed up at him.
Yeah, I'm using the.
Let my soul smile through my heart, and my heart smile through my eyes,
Copperhead, I think it's called.
that I may scatter rich smiles in sad hearts. Uganda, India, Mrs. Who said. Her welcoming smile buoyanted his heart like there was a hot air balloon beneath it. He grinned in return. Words don't usually come naturally to us, you see. We communicate much faster with thoughts, so Mrs. Who prefers to express herself with the sayings of those on your planet, Mrs. Whatsit explained. As Charles Wallace gazed at them, the word marvel slid through his thoughts. They were both marvels, and that is exactly what he was doing, marveling at their impressive, expansive minds. He didn't have to tell Meg his new word of the day, even if he could. He'd have to tell Meg his new word of the day, even if he couldn't tell her its inspiration. He wondered where the two women came from. That's the reason I chose you, you know. My excellent verbosity. I'm quite the talker, Mrs. Whatsit paddled on, as Charles Wallace looked up for the first time and saw the interlocking tree branches of the ceiling. I'm taking another peek. Yeah. So I think we're going to stop here for today because we're only halfway through this chapter. There is a lot going on in chapter 6. So it looks like Charles Wallace is coming upon two of those like celestial beings that we heard from chapter 1. They are not of this earth. And I'm really, all right, I've got to close the book because I'm cheating and I'm looking ahead. I'm really looking forward to seeing what's going to happen with these characters. And why was it that Charles Wallace was the one that kind of got drawn to them? So I'm pretty pumped to find out. All right, Bobcats. It's going to be another beautiful day. Absolutely gorgeous. And I have heard a lot of kiddos saying very excited things about their May challenge. So grab a book and find a new challenge to check off today. All right? See you later, kiddos.